The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. The military base hummed with the usual activity, mechanics shouting orders, trucks backing up to hangars, and the distant sound of helicopter blades cutting through the desert air. But inside Hangar 7, there was only silence and frustration. Colonel James Morrison stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter like it was a personal enemy. The aircraft had been grounded for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. In the military, that was an eternity. Every day it sat idle cost money, delayed training missions, and made the entire aviation division look incompetent. "Talk to me," Morrison said, his voice tight. "What are we looking at?" Captain Derek Hendricks, the base's lead maintenance officer, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He was a good man, educated, certified, and had been working on helicopters for 15 years. But even he looked defeated. "The engines are failing to maintain stable RPM during altitude transitions," Hendricks explained. "We've replaced both turbine sections. New fuel injectors, new sensors, nothing sticks. The moment the pilot pushes for more power above 8,000 feet, the whole system starts oscillating. It's like the engine is choking." Morrison felt a headache coming on. "Have we called in the contractor?" 3 times. They sent their senior technician last month. He said our mechanics were maintaining it wrong. Blamed user error, made some adjustments, took his paycheck and left. The colonel closed his eyes. User error. That was the kind of excuse that made him furious. These were some of the best mechanics in the Air Force, but nobody seemed to care about that. "Get me a full diagnostic report by end of day," Morrison said and walked out, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. 2 days later, Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen arrived at Fort Bliss in a dusty sedan that had seen better days. She pulled into the parking lot near Hangar 7, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, breathing. Sarah was 52 years old. She had been an Apache mechanic for 28 years. She'd served in Operation Desert Storm, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. She'd maintained helicopters in sandstorms, monsoons, and temperatures that made most people want to quit and go home. But a knee injury 3 years ago had forced her into a desk job at the Pentagon, pushing papers, attending meetings, and slowly dying inside. When Colonel Morrison's office had called her personally and asked if she'd take a temporary assignment to diagnose the problem at Fort Bliss, Sarah had said yes immediately. It felt like a lifeline. She grabbed her weathered canvas tool bag from the passenger seat and headed toward the hangar. Inside, she could see the Apache waiting. She ran her hand along its fuselage. The metal was warm from the desert sun. "You're the specialist from D.C., a voice called out. Sarah turned to see Captain Hendricks approaching. He had a polite smile, but his eyes didn't match it. She recognized that look. It was the look men gave women in the military when they were checking you to see if you belonged. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand. Hendricks shook it briefly. "Captain Derek Hendricks, welcome to Hangar 7. I have to be honest, we've been working on this problem for weeks. The contractor said it was beyond our capability to fix, but if you want to take a look, be my guest." There it was, the subtle dismissal. The polite way of saying, "You probably won't figure it out either, but thanks for trying." Sarah didn't say anything. She just pulled on her work gloves and walked toward the Apache. For the next 4 hours, Sarah examined every inch of the helicopter's engine system. She didn't rush, she didn't talk much. The younger mechanics working in the hangar kept glancing at her, trying to figure out what she was doing. She could hear them whispering, "That's the specialist. She's old enough to be my mom. She looks like she should be retiring, not flying around the country." Sarah blocked it out. She'd heard it all before. By late afternoon, she'd found something interesting. A hairline crack in one of the fuel manifold brackets. It was so small that most people would have missed it completely. She took photographs, made notes, and asked to speak with Captain Hendricks. "The crack is causing pressure fluctuations in the fuel system," she explained, showing him the enlarged photographs on her laptop. "When the pilot accelerates above 8,000 feet, the pressure spikes. The control system can't compensate fast enough, so the engine surges and cuts back. It's not the turbines. It's not the sensors. It's this bracket." Hendricks looked at the photos. "That's a stress fracture from the factory. It should have been caught in the initial inspection." "Should have been," Sarah agreed. "But nobody was looking for it because they were all looking in the wrong place." For a moment she thought she saw respect in his eyes. Then he nodded and said, I'll order the replacement parts, thanks for finding it. He didn't ask her opinion on installation. He didn't ask her to supervise the work. He just turned and walked back to his team. Sarah gathered her tools and headed back to the small hotel room where she was staying. The room was generic and cold, but it was quiet. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioning unit. She'd solved the problem. The hardest part was over. But as she lay there in the darkness, Sarah wondered if anyone would actually give her credit for it. Or if the credit would go to someone else, someone younger, someone male, someone who looked like they belonged. She'd spent her entire career solving problems that nobody else could solve, and every single time, the recognition went somewhere else. Tomorrow she would watch them replace the bracket. And then what? She'd go back to DC and her desk job, back to pushing papers, back to being invisible. The parts arrived the next morning. Expensive parts, the kind that required authorization from 3 different officials before anyone could even open the box. Sarah watched from a distance as Captain Hendricks and his team carefully removed the damaged manifold bracket and prepared the replacement. She wanted to oversee the installation. In a perfect world, she would have been standing right there, ensuring every bolt was torqued to specification, every seal was properly seated. But she wasn't asked. She simply observed. The installation took 6 hours. It was careful, methodical work. The mechanics were good at their jobs. Sarah had to respect that. When they finally sealed everything back up, she did a final walk around, running her hand along the fuselage one more time. "Ready for a test flight?" Colonel Morrison asked, appearing beside her without warning. Sarah nodded. "It should run clean now." "You sound confident." "I know what I found," Sarah said simply. Morrison studied her for a moment. "Captain Hendricks said you spotted a stress fracture that the contractor and 3 other teams of mechanics missed. That's impressive work." Sarah looked at him, unsure if he was being genuine or patronizing. In her experience, compliments from officers often came with hidden sting in their tail. "I just looked longer," she said. "Most people stopped looking after the first week." The colonel smiled slightly. "That's the difference between good mechanics and great ones, I think. The good ones know when to stop. The great ones keep going." He walked back toward his office, leaving Sarah alone in the hangar. The test flight was scheduled for the next morning. Sarah drove out to the airfield at dawn and found a spot near the runway where she could watch. The Apache lifted off smoothly, climbed steadily, and began its test sequence. She could see the pilot pushing the aircraft harder and harder, testing the engine at every altitude, every power setting. 20 minutes later, the helicopter touched down and the pilot climbed out. He was grinning. "She purrs like a kitten," he said to Captain Hendricks. "Whatever you did, it worked. I've never felt this bird fly smoother." Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest. Relief, validation, the feeling of knowing that your work had made a difference. But that feeling would not last long. 3 days later, Sarah was packing her bag to head back to DC when Captain Hendricks stopped by her temporary office. "The colonel wants to see you," he said. "His office right now." Sarah's stomach tightened. She followed Hendricks through the corridors of the base, her mind racing. Had she made a mistake with the diagnosis? Had the bracket replacement caused some other problem? When she walked into Colonel Morrison's office, she found him sitting behind his desk with another man, a civilian in an expensive suit. The man stood up when she entered. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Morrison said. "This is Richard Feldman. He's the director of maintenance operations for the contractor company that services our Apache fleet." Feldman extended his hand with a broad smile. "Thank you so much for your time out here, Sergeant. The colonel tells me you helped identify an issue with one of our aircraft." Sarah shook his hand cautiously. "I found a stress fracture in a manifold bracket. It was causing engine fluctuations." Yes, Feldman said smoothly. "A very minor issue, really. The kind of thing that could easily be overlooked in a routine inspection, but you caught it. Excellent work." He paused, still smiling. "I wanted to speak with you personally because I'd like to offer you a position with our company. A consultant position. You'd be based right here at Fort Bliss, helping us train our technicians and improve our diagnostic protocols. It would come with a significant raise from your military salary." Sarah's mind reeled. An offer like that was unexpected, generous even, but something about it felt wrong. "What would my job responsibilities be?" she asked carefully. Mostly training and quality control. You'd work alongside our team, share your expertise, help us understand how you spotted the issue that we missed. In return, we'd pay you $40,000 a year more than you're currently making. Colonel Morrison had been quiet, watching. Now he leaned back in his chair, waiting to see what Sarah would say. "I'd like to think about it," Sarah said. "Of course," Feldman said smoothly. "Take your time, but I should mention, part of the arrangement would include signing a standard contractor confidentiality agreement. You know, protecting trade secrets and all that. Standard stuff." There it was, the hook hidden inside the bait. A confidentiality agreement would mean she couldn't talk about this problem, couldn't tell anyone how the contractor had missed it, couldn't discuss the details of what she found or how she found it. She'd be silenced. Sarah understood what was happening now. This wasn't a job offer. This was a bribe. A generous, comfortable bribe to make her go away and keep her mouth shut. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said carefully. "But I need to stay in my current position. The Army values my service, and I have commitments in D.C. Feldman's smile faded slightly. "Think about it. The offer stands for 60 days. After that, we'll need to close it out." He left the office, shaking hands with the colonel as he went. When the door closed, Sarah and Morrison were alone. "You know what that was?" the colonel asked quietly. "An attempt to buy my silence," Sarah said. "Yes, that's exactly what it was." Morrison leaned forward. "The question now is what we do about it." Sarah looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The contractor was negligent. They missed something critical and then blamed our people for it. That's a serious problem, and it's not the first time with this company. I've had reports of similar issues from 3 other bases. Cut corners, blamed user error when problems were found, shifted responsibility." He paused. "But without evidence and documentation, I can't do anything about it." "You have the diagnostic report," Sarah said. "You have the bracket, you have the test flight results." "I have an internal report that says a foreign object damaged the bracket," Morrison said. Feldman just reframed the entire situation. He made it sound like the contractor found the problem and we fixed it. He made it sound like you just helped verify something they already knew about. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. This was how it always worked. This was why she'd spent 28 years in the military being invisible. Because when people like Feldman controlled the narrative, people like her didn't exist. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you," Morrison said. "Are you willing to make an official report? Are you willing to testify about what you found and how you found it? If you are, I can escalate this to the Army Inspector General's office. We can request a full audit of this contractor's work across the entire fleet." Sarah thought about the offer, $40,000 a year, a comfortable job, the ability to use her expertise without the physical strain on her aging body, security, peace. Then she thought about all the mechanics like her, the ones who were blamed for problems they didn't create, the ones whose work was overlooked and undervalued. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks documenting everything, every photograph she'd taken, every measurement she'd recorded, every note from her initial inspection. She wrote a detailed technical report that explained exactly what she found, how she found it, and why the stress fracture was a manufacturing defect and not user error. Then she sent it to Colonel Morrison and waited. Nothing happened for a month. Sarah returned to her desk job in D.C., back to her apartment in Arlington, back to the quiet routine of her life. She started to wonder if her report had disappeared into some bureaucratic black hole. Then in mid-April, her phone rang. It was Colonel Morrison. "The Inspector General's office wants to talk to you. They're opening an official investigation into the contractor. They want to depose you next week." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. A deposition meant lawyers, official records, sworn testimony. It meant this was becoming real. She flew back to Texas on a gray Monday morning. This time, instead of a small hotel room, she was put up in a nicer hotel near Fort Bliss. An Army paralegal named Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh picked her up and drove her to the base. "We appreciate you doing this," Walsh said as they drove through the desert landscape. "Not everyone is willing to go against a big contractor. They have good lawyers." "They should," Sarah said. "If they're doing their job right, they won't need lawyers. They'll need accountability." The deposition took place in a secure conference room on the base. 3 lawyers were present, one from the Army, one from the contractor, a woman in a tailored suit with sharp eyes, and one representing the office of the Inspector General. They had Sarah go through everything step by step. The contractor's lawyer was hostile from the beginning. "Isn't it true," she asked, "that you've been out of active fieldwork for 3 years?" "Yes," Sarah said, "I had a knee injury." "And in those 3 years, helicopter maintenance technology has advanced considerably, hasn't it?" "Some," Sarah admitted. "So it's possible you might be working from outdated knowledge." Sarah kept her voice level. "I based my inspection on the current technical manual for the AH-64D Apache. That manual is updated regularly by the Army. I followed the prescribed diagnostic procedure and found the defect." The lawyer shifted tactics. "The manifold bracket in question? It's true that this is a part manufactured by a third-party supplier and not by the primary contractor." "That's correct," Sarah said. "And isn't it true that stress fractures can occur naturally during normal operation, without any manufacturing defect?" "They can," Sarah acknowledged. "But this crack showed a clear pattern of metal fatigue originating from the point where the bracket was brazed. The brazing work was deficient. The heat treatment afterward was insufficient. This was a manufacturing problem, not a use problem." "That's your opinion," the lawyer said coolly. "That's my professional assessment," Sarah corrected, "based on 28 years of experience maintaining this aircraft." The deposition lasted 6 hours. By the end, Sarah felt exhausted. The contractor's lawyer had attacked her credibility, questioned her training, and suggested that she was mistaken or deliberately trying to embarrass the contractor for some personal reason. When it was finally over, Sarah drove back to her hotel and sat on the bed, shaking. 2 weeks later, she received a call from the Army legal team. The Inspector General had requested an independent forensic analysis of the bracket. They'd sent it to a third-party laboratory in Maryland. The lab had confirmed everything. The stress fracture was definitely a manufacturing defect. The brazing had been done improperly. The heat treatment was below specification. It was proof, solid scientific proof. But the contractor didn't give up. Their lawyers filed motion after motion. They demanded more tests. They hired expert witnesses of their own who contradicted the findings. They claimed that the original inspection should have caught the defect, and therefore it was the military's fault for not maintaining proper quality control. The whole thing became a battle of experts, documents, and legal maneuvering. Sarah watched it all from a distance. Back at her desk in D.C., she read the legal filings. She spoke with the Army's lawyers, and she began to realize that even with proof, even with the evidence clearly on their side, the military bureaucracy moved like a glacier. Everything took months. Nothing was quick. By July, she was starting to lose hope that anything would actually happen. The contractor was too big, too powerful, too well-connected. They had teams of lawyers. They had lobbyists. They had government contracts that were worth millions of dollars. And she was just one woman with a report. Then one afternoon in late July, Lieutenant Walsh called her again. "I thought you should know," Walsh said carefully, "that one of the contractor's technicians came forward. The one they sent to Fort Bliss initially. He's willing to sign a statement that the company knew about quality control issues, but decided to ignore them because reporting them would have delayed a major contract renewal." Sarah sat very still. What made him come forward? "His conscience," Walsh said. "And apparently the company fired him last month when he raised questions about their procedures. He's got nothing to lose now." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. The weight she'd been carrying for months, the doubt, the fear that nothing would change, suddenly felt a little lighter. The Army Inspector General released their findings in September. It was an official report, 47 pages, with recommendations and conclusions. The contractor had deliberately cut corners on quality control. They had not only missed the defect on the Fort Bliss Apache, but a thorough review of their maintenance work across 6 Air Force bases revealed 17 other instances where their technicians had failed to follow proper procedures. More damning, the contractor had received internal quality reports documenting these failures and had done nothing about them. The report recommended that the contractor lose their certification to work on Apache helicopters. It recommended a substantial fine. It recommended that the Army conduct a criminal investigation. Sarah read the report in her apartment, sitting on her small couch with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Her name appeared multiple times in the document. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen identified the initial defect. Chen's diagnostic expertise proved critical to the investigation. Chen's willingness to document her findings enabled this office to proceed with confidence. She was not invisible in this report. But when she checked the news, she found that the major newspapers and websites had barely covered the story. A small item in a defense industry publication. A brief mention in a military news outlet. Nothing that would reach the general public. The contractor, however, was not quiet. They issued a statement claiming that the findings were politically motivated and that they had actually been working cooperatively with the Army to address minor quality concerns. They said they had done nothing wrong and that they were reviewing their legal options. In other words, they were going to sue. Captain Hendricks called her a few days after the report came out. "I thought you should know," he said. "That word is spreading through the maintenance community. People know what you did. People know that you found something everyone else missed." "What about the contractor?" Sarah asked. "What about the message it sends if they sue and drag this out for years?" "That's above my pay grade," Hendricks admitted. "But I want you to know what you did mattered. The mechanics here know what you did mattered." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she'd learned long ago that knowing something mattered and actually getting recognition for it were two very different things. In October, the contractor filed a lawsuit against the Army, claiming that the cost of replacing defective parts across their fleet was unreasonable, and that the inspection procedures had been faulty, not their manufacturing. In November, the Army Inspector General's office asked Sarah if she would serve as an expert witness if the case went to trial. She said yes. For the next 2 months, Sarah worked with the Army's legal team preparing her testimony. She reviewed documents. She prepared presentations. She practiced answering the contractor's likely questions. The lawyers were thorough and professional, but Sarah could see the concern in their eyes. The contractor had money and power. The Army had evidence and justice. But would that be enough? By February of the following year, Sarah felt like she was living in a state of suspended animation. She was waiting for trial, waiting for justice, waiting to see if the evidence she'd found would actually matter. Then came the day that changed everything. She was at work sitting at her desk in the Pentagon when she got an urgent call from the Army's lead counsel. "You need to turn on the news," he said. "Now." Sarah brought up the news on her computer. The headline hit her like a punch. Contractor admits to quality control, failures. Major military supplier settles Army lawsuit for $18 million. Sarah read the article with her hands shaking. The contractor had decided not to go to trial. Instead, they had negotiated a settlement. They admitted to quality control failures across multiple bases. They agreed to pay significant restitution to the Army. They agreed to implement new quality procedures. They agreed to regular third-party audits of their work. And there, in the middle of the article, was a quote from the Deputy Secretary of the Army. This resolution was made possible because one dedicated service member refused to accept a faulty explanation and followed the evidence wherever it led. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen's professional integrity and willingness to stand by her findings demonstrated exactly what we value in the military. Sarah read that sentence 3 times. She couldn't quite believe it was real. Her phone started buzzing with text messages. Captain Hendricks, Lieutenant Walsh, colleagues from her desk job, they'd all seen the news. But the moment that made Sarah cry was when her daughter called. "Mom, I just saw the news," her daughter Sarah Jr. said breathlessly. "It's you, it's all about you, I'm so proud of you." Sarah sat at her desk in the Pentagon, surrounded by people working at other desks, and she cried. Not sad tears. Not tears of anger, but the kind of tears you cry when someone finally sees you, when someone finally recognizes your worth, when decades of invisible work suddenly becomes visible. The celebration didn't last long. 2 weeks later, Sarah received an official letter from Army Human Resources. She was being offered a promotion. Major, based on her work on this investigation and her overall service record. She would be assigned to a new position in the Chief of Staff's office, heading up a quality control oversight division for military contractors. It was the kind of opportunity that should have made her happy. It was recognition. It was validation. It was the exact thing she'd been waiting for her entire career. But Sarah read the letter 3 times, and she realized something that surprised her. She didn't want it. She was 54 years old. Her knee still ached on cold mornings. She'd spent the last 3 years at a desk, and those years had nearly broken her. She didn't want to spend the next 10 years in an office overseeing contractors. She wanted to work with her hands. She wanted to see the results of her work immediately. She wanted to fly in a helicopter and know that she'd kept someone alive. She called Colonel Morrison. "I'm going to decline," she told him. There was a long pause. "May I ask why?" "I'm going to retire," Sarah said. "My service is done. I think I've earned the right to decide when I'm finished." "You've earned far more than that," Morrison said quietly. "For what it's worth, your decision makes perfect sense. You've spent your whole life giving to the military. You deserve to take something for yourself now." Sarah retired from the Army on a sunny day in March. There was a small ceremony at Fort Bliss, attended by Captain Hendricks and his team. The base commander shook her hand. They gave her a plaque. Everyone said kind things. But what mattered most came 3 days later, when she got an unexpected visitor at her apartment in Arlington. It was the contractor's technician, the one who had come forward and told the truth. His name was Miguel Torres, and he was 58 years old. He looked tired. "I wanted to apologize," he said when Sarah invited him in for coffee. "I should have spoken up earlier, but I had a family to feed and I was scared of losing my job." "You did speak up eventually," Sarah said. "That matters." "The company fired me anyway," Miguel said. "But I got another job, better company, better people, and I got to look myself in the mirror every morning." He paused. "I read about your retirement. I read about how you stood up against them. I just wanted to thank you for not backing down, for not taking their offer, for doing what was right even when it was hard." After he left, Sarah sat on her porch and watched the sun set over Arlington. She thought about all the years she'd spent in the military, all the thankless work, all the times her expertise had been dismissed or overlooked, all the moments when she'd felt invisible. But she thought about that moment in the hangar at Fort Bliss when she'd found the stress fracture. She thought about the look on the pilot's face when he'd landed the test flight and said the helicopter purred like a kitten. She thought about Captain Hendricks saying, "The mechanics here know what you did mattered." She thought about her daughter saying, "I'm so proud of you." And she thought about the Deputy Secretary of the Army's statement. One dedicated service member refused to accept a faulty explanation and followed the evidence wherever it led. That was the real reward, not the promotion she'd turned down, not the fame or recognition, but the knowledge that she had followed her conscience and the truth, even when it was hard, even when it was lonely, even when nobody else was paying attention. 6 months later, Sarah got a phone call that surprised her. It was a documentary filmmaker. She wanted to make a film about Sarah's story, about how a veteran mechanic had exposed corruption at a major defense contractor. The filmmaker had seen the news coverage and tracked Sarah down. She wanted to tell the whole story from beginning to end. Sarah almost said no. She'd had enough of attention and recognition. She just wanted to rest. But then she thought about all the young mechanics out there, all the women in the military who were told they didn't belong, all the people who saw an injustice and wondered if it was worth speaking up. "Okay," Sarah said, "but I want you to tell the truth about what it costs, the pressure, the isolation, the fear. I want people to understand that standing up for what's right isn't noble or easy. It's hard and painful and lonely, and it's worth doing anyway." The documentary premiered at a small film festival in Washington, D.C. in 2023. Sarah sat in the theater and watched her own story unfold on screen. She saw herself as others had seen her, not as a problem to be solved or an old woman past her prime, but as someone with expertise, courage, and integrity. The film was called The Engine Specialist, and it won the Audience Choice Award at the festival. But the real ending came a year later, when the Army made an unexpected announcement. They were reviewing all of the contractors' work going back 15 years. They found not 17 defects, but 83. 83 instances where the contractor had cut corners or failed to follow proper procedures. The contractor's CEO resigned in disgrace. The company paid over $100 million in settlements. And perhaps most importantly, the Army implemented Sarah's recommendations for independent quality audits across all contractor work. One afternoon in the fall of 2024, Sarah was sitting in her apartment when she received a call from a young woman. The woman was a mechanic on an Air Force base in Nevada. She'd heard about Sarah's story and wanted to report a quality control problem she'd found at her base. She was scared, she said. She worried about retaliation. She didn't know if it was worth speaking up. "It is," Sarah told her. "It's always worth it." "How do you know?" the young mechanic asked. Sarah looked out her window at the Arlington trees, golden in the autumn sunlight. She thought about all the invisible work, all the moments of doubt, all the times she'd questioned if anything she did mattered. "Because someone has to care about the truth," Sarah said. "Someone has to be willing to stand up and say it out loud. That's not easy, but it changes things, and it changes you." After they hung up, Sarah went into her garage and looked at the old Apache model sitting on her shelf, a gift from the base at Fort Bliss. She picked it up and examined it, running her finger along the fuselage. "Thank you," she whispered to the aircraft, to the memories, to the long and difficult journey that had finally brought her to this moment. "Thank you for waiting for me to find you." And in the quiet of her garage, Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, retired, finally understood that she had never been invisible at all. She had been seen all along by the people who mattered, by the mechanics who knew her work, by the officers who valued her integrity, by the young people she would inspire to stand up for what was right. Her story wasn't over, it was just beginning, and this time everyone could see it.